All right, looks like we are live, and I'm all pumped up now after that new intro we've got going on for Team Standing for Truth. And I want to welcome everybody to Standing for Truth, though. I am your host, Donnie, and we have a great show for everybody today. As always, it is an absolute privilege to have Professor David McQueen with us here today. He has been a tremendous blessing to this ministry, and I am jealous of his hat that he's rocking this evening. Very cool, Professor McQueen. I love it. So before we introduce the topic, though, for today, just a few reminders for everybody. Matt and I have been busy working on two new books that we are doing our best to have released for everybody this September. One of them has to do with debunking the local flood compromise and these arguments pertaining to the ancient Near Eastern interpretations of the Bible. For example, these arguments coming from John Walton, Michael Heiser, so on and so forth. So we're working on that one, as well as the Human Evolution Handbook, which is coming along nicely. It's going to be thorough and extensive for everybody. So definitely a lot to look forward to. Also, a reminder that this Thursday, we've got an epic end times theology debate. So kind of an in-house debate between Kent Hovind and Stacy Turbeville. So a lot to look forward to there. We've got a ton of events in the upcoming live stream section of the channel. So please check that out to make sure that you are up to date on all the upcoming streams that we have. So that being said, enough from me. Professor McQueen, George Bond, brothers, thanks so much for being here today.
Well, I must say, George, I was really impressed with that Justice League of America, Superman, Batman. I'm a comic book collector going back 60 years to my youth, and I have some of those comic books, so that's good. How are you today, George?
Very good, thank you. I had a collection of comic books as well until my mum found them under my bed and threw them in the rubbish bin.
Yeah. If my mom did that to my comic book collection, we'd be in trouble. I'm like you, Professor McQueen. I've got quite a few comic books as well. So you're perfect for the team, David. I appreciate that, brother.
My mom was a pack rat and made me one. George, I wanted to show you a gift I got. I was at the store and found this Waikia, and notice what it says. It's Hawaiian volcanic water.
Whoa.
Wow.
So I'm going to mail this to Australia for you, because on the back of it, it's got the pH and total dissolved solids. All the chemistry we need is that water goes down through the volcano there on the big island of Hawaii and becomes groundwater saturated from the rocks.
I'll look forward to it, David. Since we're talking about water,
yes.
just yesterday, a man came up to the door and knocked and said, please, could you spare a small donation towards the local swimming pool? I said, sure, just wait here. I went over to the kitchen and got him a glass of water.
Yes.
That's good, George. That's good. I like it.
That's what we need, is thinking outside the box.
Yeah.
Well,
I'm not sure that's quite what they meant, George, but you know what? The thought and the generosity was there. And that water, and that water, Professor McQueen, that kind of water will keep you young forever.
Oh, yeah. So they claim it's probably bottled in Canada by a false name of things. George and I want to begin our discussion today of the Grand Canyon. And it's something that we've mentioned in pieces over the last 6 months. And so we want to dedicate a whole session to it. Now that we've begun our hike, I can take my hat, which competes quite well, I might add, with old John Mackay's hat. He needs to get rid of that ragged thing and get another one, I think. But we'll talk about that with him another day. The Grand Canyon provides remarkable evidence for what Standing for Truth taught us last week concerning the fact that the flood is worldwide and not local. George, that finishes my 5-minute intro. You want to give an intro to what your thoughts are about the Grand Canyon?
Actually, before you do, George, if I could, brother, I just wanted to, because as always, we're always getting new subscribers to the channel. We're up to roughly 12,000 on the Young Earth Creation channel, and we're almost at 5,000 here on Standing for Truth. So anybody new to the channel, please check out Professor David McQueen's book, The Mineral Book. Definitely a must read, as well as please check the description box for more on Professor David McQueen. I've got a playlist with well over 20 videos where you can find our previous lectures, presentations, and talks with David. So that being said, George, I'm going to hand it over to you, brother. No problem.
No problem. I'll start off with my usual prelude. May the Spirit of God open your eyes to the light,
Amen.
your ears to the truth, and your heart to His Son, the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, now when David talked to me about the Grand Canyon presentation, it was quite appropriate, actually, because about 2 weeks before that, I purchased a book by Steve Austin called Grand Canyon Monument to Catastrophe. And it's a fantastic book, by the way. For those people that think it's only creationist sources, this book is littered, and I'm talking hundreds and hundreds of references of various secular articles and papers. So it's not just a creationist book. It looks at all the evidence. So
Exactly.
what I'd just like to say, without going into the detail, now evolutionists usually approach the evidence with a presupposition that sedimentation occurred slowly. Okay, creationists usually presume rapid sedimentary processes. We'll show you that catastrophic flood processes appear to explain the most common strata of the Grand Canyon. And you'll see some evidences that David and I will present that will actually support that. In many ways, one of these is the erosion surfaces or the unconformities between strata can best be reconciled with catastrophic flood model with rapid deposition of the thick strata sequences. And there's more than just that, but we'll go into that a bit more in detail. David, if I can share the screen just to introduce the audience to some of the things that we're going to be talking about
Yes,
in the Grand Canyon.
Please do.
It just shows a diagram of the Grand Canyon and the various layers that are associated with it, so that at least they've got a bit of a background knowledge of what we're going to talk about and what they are.
Thank you, sir. Yes.
And I can see the share audio now button standing.
Awesome.
So glad you found
perfected it, brother.
All right, can you see that?
Yes, sir.
All right. So that's the book I was mentioning to you about. The it's full of references, by the way, and it's a great book. We'll show you some of those later on. But that's the diagram I wanted to show you. You can see there that that's the cross section of the Grand Canyon. That's the river at the base there. I'll specifically be talking about the red wall limestone. But you'll notice there's these terms, tapete. You would have heard about the tapete sandstone, the bright angel, the muav below the red wall, the supai, the hermit, the coconino, the kebab at the very top. So just to get your mind around that, there's some of the layering that we're going to look at. And when we talk about red wall, that bit there, you'll know exactly what we're actually talking about. All right, so how do I stop it now? I've hidden it. No. Shouldn't have done that.
No problem. We have time. As you find it, I'll comment to the audience. I'm going to do a 20-minute introduction. George is going to do a 20-minute presentation. Then we'll take questions from what we think of as our class up until the 1 hour break. George and SFT will pick up there as I take a break. Then we'll come back for two 20-minute sections after the break. So there's a lot of information, and we're very thankful to be here with you guys.
Amen. So that being said, anybody in the class today, please tag me with your questions, objections, inquiries, clarifications, whatever it is. Tag me at Standing for Truth, and I will save them for George and Professor McQueen. Looks like we got it up on screen, George.
I see the diagram, Brother George.
Okay. Haven't you stopped sharing me? You can stop sharing me standing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So are we moving into Professor McQueen's 20-minute introduction?
Yeah. Let me do the 20-minute introduction, and we need to start where we have started so many times in the past. Notice over my shoulder that I've been talking about this since May of 2020, the geology of Noah's flood. At the top of the screen is my email address, direct one at gmail.com if you want to contact me. In the years that Ms. McQueen and I have taught the Bible to children, we've summarized Noah's flood in these words: crud, flood, mud, and rainbow. The crud carrying the idea that the flood was judgment on mankind's sin. The actual flood in Genesis 7, the receding flood waters talked about in Genesis 8, and then the rainbow promise after that. And so, as we always do, we are taking a two-model approach. We want to ask the question, the Grand Canyon that George showed you in that cross-section, is it best explained in an old Earth, slow, tedious process, or a young Earth, active, catastrophic process not so long ago? Well, let's go back to Genesis chapter 7, and let's read and refresh our minds on what this flood geology model would be. As I've mentioned in the past, there was geologic activity certainly on the first day of creation and the third day of creation. That's what I call CW1 and CW3. Then there was activity in the time before the flood. The word that's often used is antediluvian or pre-flood world. And then we come up to the 600th day of Noah, 600th year of Noah, and we read this beginning in Genesis 7:4. For after 7 more days, I will cause it to rain on the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and I will destroy from the face of the earth all living things that I have made. Now, for our purposes today, let's dispel the old Sunday school idea that Noah's flood simply lasted 40 days, and dispel the idea that there are all kinds of giraffes with their necks sticking out of a toy ark. This was a serious craft, a barge designed to save everything that breathed air. The fish, the seagoing mammals, they could make it through the flood. They didn't make it all the way through. But we're going to see that the 40 days is what I've come to call flood phase 1. And it's indicative of that period of the Tapete sandstone that we're going to talk so much about. We want to be as Noah in verse 5. And Noah did according to all that the Lord commanded him. Noah was 600 years old when the flood of waters was on the earth. If you go back to last week's session, you'll find a 20-minute, very good argument for why biblically the flood must have been global, not local. Then you drop down to verse 11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, second month, 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. And the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. So where did this water come from? Some of it came from whatever the canopy was, the second day of creation, which is turning out to be one of the most complicated days of the creation week. And the water also came up from below. Dr. Henry Morris was trained in hydrology and always put a great deal of focus on waters that were subterranean. But that's not all. There was volcanic activity at that time also. And so you've got the windows of heaven and the fountains of the great deep. And then you go down, and let's skip all the way to the end of that chapter, to verses 23 and 24, and continue to build a Bible-based model of the great flood. So God destroyed all living things which were on the face of the ground, both man and cattle, creeping things, and birds of the air. They were destroyed from the earth. Only Noah and those who were with him in the ark remained alive. And the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. So I would challenge you, class, to go back to Genesis 7, 8, 9, 10, and start adding these numbers up, keeping in mind that Methuselah, who lived 969 years, probably died the year of the flood. And if you begin to add these up, you see, as we have taught the children, Ms. McQueen came up with this, everybody had a birthday on the ark. The dinosaurs, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, their wives, Noah and his wife, all the 8 people had a birthday on board the ark. And the flood lasted a complete year. Now, if you start adding these up, you'll see we're about 6 months into the flood at this point. And then we come to the very important beginning of chapter 8 in Genesis, where it says, and God remembered Noah. No children in the audience. God didn't forget Noah. He guided the ark all during that year. And all the animals which were with him on the ark. And God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters subsided. Not far from me here in Louisiana, there is a petrified forest, the only one really, that's east of the Mississippi River, in the state of Mississippi. And there's ample evidence there of wind-blown sediment associated with these floating logs, a topic for another time. The fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven were also stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. So it didn't just rain 40 days and 40 nights. That was very intense, but it rained essentially 6 months. And the waters receded continually from the earth, it says in verse 3. And at the end of the 150 days, the waters decreased. The old King James vocabulary is rising and assuaging. So the waters rose essentially for 6 months and then descended for an additional 6 months. Let me keep track of my time here. Okay, by way of introduction, I want to use this diagram here. GRCA is the code I've used for 40 years to describe my research in the Grand Canyon, GRCA, Grand Canyon. And we'll start with the 2 basic things that we have to explain in the canyon. We have to explain how the deposits got there, and then the erosion of the canyon. The flood model that I've put together over the last 40 years is indicated on this side here with a code CW for Creation Week, Flood Phase 1, and what may be Coconino and so forth, Flood Phase 2. So how do we get the deposition of the rocks and the erosion of the rocks? Those are the 2 things that the old Earth community has to explain, and we in the young Earth community have to explain. And so, using my favorite modeling clay, Play-Doh, we have to add the science to this that George knows so well as an engineer. This Play-Doh has a compressive strength, it has a shear strength, it has a Young's modulus, and the research that Dr. John Morris, Dr. Andrew Snelling have done over the years shows that the consistency of the rocks beginning with the tapetes and going up was that of a modeling clay. Now for today, we'll use this purple color to illustrate the Creation Week rocks, which were solid and eroded by the flood, also tilted up like this. And then we'll take some modeling clay that's yellow. This is the traditional geologic color for a sandstone. And a sandstone shale, like the tapetes, is right above. In the 1980s, I hiked the canyon 5 times in 4 years. And one of the thrilling things that I saw was this contact between the Creation Week rocks and the Tapete sandstone just above what's called the inner gorge. And then as we go along, we'll see there are other layers. I will skip to blue Play-Doh, which is the traditional color for limestone. We're leaving out some things, aren't we? And then we go up to the red wall limestone. Standing for truth, if you can hear me, I'd like for you to put that diagram that you created for me up on my screen. And we'll talk about why it's so interesting to go from the tapetes up to the red wall limestone.
Are you referring to the diagram I had, David?
No, I'm talking about a secret diagram that I sent Standing for Truth.
Secret.
If he's there. Are you there? Well, he may not be there. He'll come in a minute. The diagram that I want to show you is from the 1997 field notebook that we put together at ICR. I hiked the canyon with the Australian Ken Ham that year. And you can see in this cross-section diagram here, the inner gorge, the Tapete sandstone, and on up that we were talking about. I'll save that diagram for when Standing for Truth gets back. Now, let's go now to the first unit that we want to look at. This is the Tapete sandstone or shale. And if you look on a geologic map, you find this C with the cross through it, which means Cambrian. And one of the things that I've taught for years that's very important for you guys to know is, where do we get the name Cambrian? Well, let me take a sip of the flood water here, and we'll talk about where the word Cambrian comes. Here is a model that we put together. You see the gravel and sand down at the bottom, the flood waters, and then Noah's Ark floating on top of this model here. Those first sandstones and shales were called the Tapete sandstone. And that's the word that's given in the Western United States. If you go to other parts of the world, like if you go to England and Wales, there is a Cambrian sandstone there also. And that the issue becomes, where did this word Cambrian come from? Is it a word? And let me move my head here. Do you see the geologic column over my shoulder there? Yes. Is it a word, Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian? Are these words coined by the evolutionary community? No, not at all. So let's spend a moment and look at the meaning of the Tapete sandstone and its equivalents worldwide. Now, did you hear what I said? Its equivalents worldwide. if we're talking about a worldwide catastrophe, as we read from the Bible, we would expect that a similar rock types would be found right above what are commonly called the Precambrian rocks worldwide. And those rocks are called the tapetes in the United States. But if you go to the part of England called Wales, which is northwest of London, and it's kind of in the central area of England, you find what we call the type locality of the Salk sequence. Now, we'll return to that after the break, but let me tell you a story that's fascinating and so very important about the rocks there in Wales. Recall from previous discussions that the sandstones resulted from beautiful quartz crystals like these being hit by the floodwaters and tumbled into essentially beach sand, which was moved worldwide during especially the first 40 days, but in the months after that. So this silicon dioxide, this quartz, was tumbled and formed a blanket sediment, what Tim Cleary in his book calls a sequence stratigraphy vocabulary. And this is the vocabulary of Salk and Tippecanoe and Zuni and all these kind of things. But remember that in the traditional geologic vocabulary, you've got carry out some dinner, Miss Penny Pearl. You've got Cambrian, tapetes, Ordovician, which is missing from the Grand Canyon, as we'll see. Carry out some, Silurian is missing from the Grand Canyon. You get up to some Devonian strata, and then we move on up to the Red Wall limestone. Tremendous lesson to be found in what's not in the Grand Canyon. So if I take the whole world in my hands, of course, for Georgia's sake, we have to put the center of the world there, which is, of course, Australia.
Yes.
And you go the rest of the way around the world, you've got the Grand Canyon, of course, in the western United States. But the Tapete Sandstone goes all the way over into Wales in England. And it ends up in the classroom. Thank you for my diagram. Let me talk over this diagram. On the right-hand side of my secret diagram are the actual rock formations found in the Grand Canyon. To the left side are the missing strata. George, don't you find it interesting that you've got this block? Let me move my hand up and point right there.
Yep.
You've got this missing block of Ordovician and Silurian. And so if you go to the book, go ahead and put the screen back, please. Drop that image for the moment. I'll come back to it repeatedly. If you go to a tabletop book like Redford's Corridors of Time, that's where that diagram comes from. And so the evolutionary community says, oh, well, see, the Grand Canyon doesn't go all the way up to the dinosaurs. Oh, no. It stops at the Coconino where there's some reptile footprints, but no reptiles. And they're missing strata in between. They call these unconformities. Okay, we'll return to that in a second.
David?
Yes.
David, can I add, in that diagram that was popped up earlier,
Yeah.
that missing,
put it back and let George talk about it.
That missing layer that you were pointing to,
yes,
just for the audience, they should understand that missing layer represents, I think, 140 to about 160 million years.
Exactly. Very significant.
That's a lot of time.
Yeah. And if you'll put the diagram up one more time, SFT, I'll point out to our class or our audience, all of the gray layers on the left, those are missing stratigraphic units. Those are missing units of time in the Grand Canyon. What you actually find in the Grand Canyon is the colored area in the middle. Okay, you can drop it, and I'll finish my story about Dr. Sedgwick, and I should be coming up to my 20 minutes here. So, Professor Dr. Pastor Adam Sedgwick, I might add, was the one in England that took his students every year out to see the Tapete sandstone. If you'll put my image back up there, I'll show once again where this is from, SFT. Notice that the equivalent of the Tapetes is found in Wales. And so, as a college professor during most of my life, I can see old Sedgwick going up to the board every year and saying, well, I'm going to take you to Wales and show you a sandstone shale unit that's got some trilobites in it. And it also has a very unique green mineral called glauconite. And we're going to take a look at it. So they all go by train and they go out to Wales from where he was teaching, and they see this. Well, along the way, they're aware that the ancient Celtic tribe called the Cambri are from this part of Wales. And so after a few years, Sedgwick said, I'm going to make my life easier. I'm just going to say we're going to go look at the Cambrian rocks. And so the very idea of the Tapete sandstone having the name Cambrian has nothing to do with geologic time. The 500, 600 million years, that was tagged on later. When Professor Pastor Adam Sedgwick went out there, he was talking about the Bishop Ussher dates of this. He was critical of Lyell and others that were saying that the Tapetes was a product of long time. His Cambrian stuck. And so one of the most interesting things about these words, Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian. Devonian is named for Devonshire, where you found fish fossils. Carry out some dinner, Mississippian, Pennsylvanian. That's the Carboniferous, the coal seams of England. And then you go higher than that, you get to the Triassic rocks of Europe. Trias, 3 different basic layers that were noticeable. So you go on and on. All of these words, pragmatically, were coined by creationists. And so when we think about the word Cambrian, how can we imagine it to be spread all the way to the Appalachian Mountains, where I was taught about the Rome Shale near Knoxville, Tennessee. And the Rome Shale is a shale that is red, having trilobites, having this mineral glauconite in it. How did that get named the Cambrian? Well, let's refresh our memory on history. George, you can help me with this. You know, when Sedgwick was teaching in the 1800s, finish this sentence for me, George, from world history. The sun did not set. And what's the rest of the sentence?
I think it's something like on the empire.
Exactly.
Meaning the British Empire.
Exactly. Sun did not set on the British Empire. So when Sedgwick's students began to teach geology themselves in America, and the criminal element of these geologists went to Australia. No, I'm just kidding. When the geologists went over to Australia, they found similar rocks, and they went out west, found similar rocks. They said, oh, this is what Dr. Sedgwick taught us, Pastor Sedgwick taught us at the university. We're going to call these Cambrian. So this word, this symbol of the sea here, I'll get to it, for the Cambrian rocks spread worldwide. And that's where you have birth to the vocabulary of stratigraphy. We're going to talk quite a bit more about stratigraphy after the hour break. But for now, I'll simply summarize by saying that the creationist model for the Grand Canyon provides an explanation for how these horizontal layers were laid down. And then in the final 6 months of the flood, how they began to be eroded into the canyon itself. Furthermore, the vocabulary of the Grand Canyon Cambrian, and so forth, was coined by creationists. When I hiked the canyon 5 times in 4 years, I went looking for fossils like this huge shark's tooth. Or up in the Coconino, I expected to find something like this Louisiana snapping turtle. This is not all of his mouth, but it's what's left. But I didn't find them. What did I find? Every fossil that's there, every trilobite, every crinoid, and all the rest, they appear abruptly and fully formed. I went out there during those 5 hikes in 4 years looking for evidence of evolution, and it's simply not there. George, could you take over from that point, please?
Probably the obvious one is to explain why it's actually called the red wall limestone.
Yes.
I mean, it's actually a stain. It's stained red by seepage and coating of the red clays that are above it, coming from the shales, etc. So the reddish coating has also actually an accretionary effect, which aids in the cliff stability. So I guess that's another point. Now we're going to talk about some evidences, but there's multiple evidences that suggest that it was a catastrophe. Marine fossils, for example, they find ribbed brachiopods, gastropods, foraminifera, crinoids, and corals occur at levels at 500 on the 500-foot cliff. By the way, it actually thickens towards the northwest, where it reaches a thickness of about 800 feet, and then thins out towards the east. Let's see. We find rock layers that can be traced all the way across continents. This is what we talk. Sometimes you'll hear us talk about mega sequences. Well, they've actually traced all these across the continents and even between the continents.
Yes.
The physical features in these strata indicate they were deposited rapidly. For example, the Tepete sandstone and the red wall limestone of the Grand Canyon that Professor McQueen mentioned earlier can be traced across the entire United States up into Canada and even across the Atlantic Ocean to England. Now, come on, people, that's a mega sequence. You can't get that over a slow deposition over millions of years or billions of years. So I mentioned that the horizontal strata represent almost 300 million years of deposition, but yet extremely little erosion is found within and between the layers. So you would expect over, especially in that particular missing layer that Professor McQueen was pointing to, of 140 to 160 million years, you'd expect things like channels, even smaller canyons would have eroded into those layers over such a long period. Yet we don't find any evidence of that at all. Actually, there is very little evidence for erosion of those huge missing geological layers. But in the same breath, the evolutionists will want you to believe that the tiny Colorado River eroded the canyon in 5 to 6 million years. Here we're talking about 140 to 160 million years. Come on.
Yeah, it's amazing. Very, very well said.
Now, I mentioned that the book that Steve Austin has written is a fantastic resource if you want to know things about it. But another interesting point that he makes about the actual limestone itself, he says there are strong dissimilarities, not similarities, but dissimilarities between the modern shallow water lime muds, which are dominated by silt-sized crystals, approximately 20 microns, by the way, in diameter, and mainly of the mineral aragonite, around 60 to 95%, and around 10% calcite, which is derived from disaggregation or abrasion of skeletons of marine organisms. Now, these ancient lime mudstones or micritic limestones are abundant in the canyon, okay, and are dominated by clay-sized crystals less than 4 microns in diameter. That's 20% of the size of the modern limestone. Okay,
Now,
and the
those
actual
of you that have been following George and I over the last 2 months should know this word micrite. This is what's found in the Bahama Banks, and this is what George and I are arguing is a chemical limestone that directly precipitates from the flood waters. Go ahead, George. Excellent point.
Yeah. Dr. Austin actually provides some references here, secular references that say this is one quote, direct quote. It says micritic limestones composed essentially of calcite have textures quite different from those of the aragonite dominated modern limestones or lime muds that have long been regarded as their precursors. Okay, so notice the dissimilarity there. Another quote says, modern carbonate sediments contrast sharply in their chemistry and mineralogy with ancient carbonate rocks. So again, there's another dissimilarity. And then he goes on to say, furthermore, another quote here, and there are references for all these in the book. He says, furthermore, the grain or the crystal size distribution and grain or the crystal shape, so the size and the shape characteristics of the modern lime mud sediment are very different from their lithified counterparts.
Okay, let me interject some mineralogy here. These are what are called cleavage fragments, rhombohedral cleavage fragments of calcite. This is calcium carbonate, and another example of a cleavage rhomb. When George uses the word aragonite, that's another carbonate mineral that's related to CaCO3, calcium carbonate, but it's another mineral. I just want you to be clear on that. George, go on.
Yeah, thanks. Now, the lime mud problem has apparently become more apparent in recent years as they've done more and more research into it. And I believe Dr. Snelling was about to do an excursion or an investigation into the Grand Canyon a couple of years ago now, I think, and they actually refused his permit.
Yes.
Why on earth would you do that, you know?
So that's a very interesting story. And those of you in our class that are looking to buy books, this is Dr. Snelling's The Earth's Catastrophic Past. It's a 2-volume tome. Took him years to write, and you should add that to your list. George, go on. Let's go for 5 more minutes with you and then take questions before the break.
Yeah, no worries. I mean, another piece of evidence is the rapid deposition of the lime mud. We've spoken about this in other streams where one of the arguments evolutionists or deep time proponents actually use is the high velocity of the water couldn't possibly deposit these limestones, and there have been research projects done where that's been disproved. Flocculation can occur even at high energy systems. Actually, two scientists have reported that these lime mud beds occurring within a high energy bank margin environment, not usually considered to be the site of mud-sized particle deposition, and he gives a reference there. So there's a lot of evidence that is coming to the fore that suggests a catastrophic deposition rather than a long time slow deposition rate.
Excellent. George, let's break it there.
Okay.
And go back to SFT. Let's spend 10 minutes on audience questions, please. Can you pick one out and put it up?
Absolutely. So here's a question, Professor McQueen, and of course, George, if you want to get your input. So,
I do want his input. Yes.
So here is a criticism of the global flood model, and The question is, critics of the global flood model have asserted that there are examples of fossils that have been subjected to scavengers. How is this possible during a catastrophic worldwide flood?
Okay, I'll take the first shot of that as soon as I find where I put my shark's tooth. When the flood hit in the 600th year of Noah, there were no doubt around the one worldwide continent that we've talked about before, the C-shaped continent for creation. This continent that variously is called Pangea, the Tethys is in it, and so forth. There were dead sharks around in the decades, in the centuries leading up to the time of the flood. They probably washed up on the very extensive shoreline that was all around that one world continent. And so imagine, this is an enormous shark's tooth. I think comes from the genus called Megalodon, if I'm clear on where I got it. And if I put it up close to the edge, if I put it up close to the camera, you'll see the sharp teeth there on that. But also if I move it to this area, you'll see some parts that have been broken off. Maybe they were broken off as this tumbled against the quartz that was being knocked off of the granites and so forth as the floodwaters were receding. And so the fact that you see evidence of parasitic activity, that you find evidence that not every hole in this, now this is a modern Louisiana snapping turtle, but not every hole in this thing is due to anatomy. Some of the holes may be from predators that bit into this thing. And so I would counter argue that individual that suggested that is not thinking globally and not thinking catastrophically. What do you think, George?
Well, one of the problems I think with that thinking is they believe that everything would have died in the first day. No, they wouldn't have. There would have been progressive deaths, and animals being animals, they need to survive and eat. So if they find a dead carcass nearby, of course they're going to eat it because they're hungry.
Right.
And as the waters rised and the sediments came in, they got buried. So they're easily explained.
Now, let me build on what George said. Please look at the chart behind me here. This is a geologic column that begins with Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, carry out some dinner, Miss Penny Pearl, 2 Johnny Clock, Triassic, 2 Johnny, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, the Queen, Tertiary, Quaternary. And so as you go up this chart, creation scientists like Dr. Gary Parker have suggested for years that this is ecological zonation, that the reason that you don't find humans that often in sediments that contain dinosaurs is the same reason that George chooses not to live on the Great Barrier Reef where the sharks would eat him alive, and I choose not to live in the swamps of Louisiana where creatures this size could eat me alive. And so alligators, crocodiles, I'm not going to be around them. And if I've got a creature the size of Brachiosaurus, the old Brontosaurus or T-Rex, I'm not going to stand around and be stepped on by these people or these things, right? So what's the next question, my friend, SFT?
Great response, brothers David and George, because this was a criticism that I heard recently by a theistic evolutionist who thought that this was like a fatal blow to the global flood model, and you guys answered it so perfectly and easily, really. So I appreciate that, gentlemen. So next question then is, Here's another question that has been put forth by a critic. Okay, so the question is objection to the biblical explanation of the Grand Canyon is that what we find is a winding river and not what would be expected from a flood. Is this a valid objection? Is this something you've heard, Professor McQueen?
Oh, yes. And I've been hearing this for 40 years. Where to begin on this? Remember in my intro, I challenged the evolutionary community to explain two things. To explain the deposition of the strata, starting with the peats. I colored in the red wall for my brother George there. That symbol with the upside down and right side up T, that's a symbol for limestone on maps. The tree at the top means this is a cross section. And the dots are for sandstones, such as the Coconino sandstone. So we have to explain the deposit of the Grand Canyon. But we can't stop there. We've got to go to this side of the chart, and we've got to explain the erosion of the Grand Canyon. So our basic argument is that during the first 6 months of the flood, the layers either directly precipitated out or were deposited over huge areas of the American Southwest. I'm talking about huge areas of Arizona, Utah, New Mexico. And some of these rock layers extend quite extensively. Okay, so we then create a Grand Canyon that's got layer after layer. And we're going to put this yellow Coconino sandstone up at the top. And this is not some sort of Ghostbusters burger here with green slime in the middle. This is a sedimentary rock and a section through it all. Well, how do we get the erosion on this? Back in the 80s, this is 40 years ago, Dr. Steve Austin began working on an idea of how you get the erosion of the canyon. Well, I can remember so clearly at the University of Michigan, professors bragging about they had this computer model that showed how the Colorado River could have eroded the Grand Canyon. Remember that the Colorado River, the modern Colorado River, below the South Rim, at an area called the South Rim near the Visitor Center, it's only 90 feet wide. George will do the conversion to meters if he can for me. 90 feet, 100 feet. Let's use 100 feet. It's a very small river. How could it have eroded a canyon that's over 200 miles long? Well, if you will Google three of us that have written a paper in Andrew Snelling's online journal, it's Austin, Ed Holroyd, and David McQueen. The three of us have written a paper suggesting that a impounded lake upstream, what I mean by that is, let me take a drink of the flood water. Oh, there were trilobites in there. I'm sorry. There was an impounded lake northeast of the Grand Canyon. That lake was breached by a process called spillover, and actually eroded the Grand Canyon. It is patently ridiculous. My 5-year-old granddaughter that lives in Mississippi, it's obvious to her that the Grand Canyon, the Colorado River, is flowing in a structure that was eroded. George, take it over from there, my friend.
Yeah, well, I remember in university, David, we did quite a few experiments on channel erosion to determine Manning's numbers for various different materials.
Yes.
But one of the things you find about water seems to find its path of least resistance. So depending, if you've ever watched, say, a farm dam breach its bank,
yes,
you'll notice the water will flow depending on the topography. And as it follows that topography, it starts eroding. And you can see that happening today. So I can't see what the issue is with these meanders that they talk about being a problem. I don't see it as a problem. It's observable evidence that that's what water does.
Yeah, and thank you, Standing for Truth, for pulling up that article. That is exactly your homework assignment for next week. Those of you that think of yourselves as students here in it's a beautiful satellite view of the Grand Canyon and extent. Look that up and use that as your homework assignment. Okay, SFT, let's take a third one, and then I'll go on my 1 hour break after I have my say.
Okay. Here's a question that came in recently that I can put onto the screen for you. Saved by Grace. Question for David. Critics of the flood will at times argue Noah could not have built the ark because people in those days were primitive, quote unquote. So what evidence is there to show ancient man was intelligent?
Okay, that's an excellent question. And let's go back to the Bible as a historical evidence. And let's look at one of my favorite guys from those days, a fellow named Tubal-Cain. So we're going to go before Genesis 6, and we're going to go back, and we're going to look up where it talks about Tubal-Cain, and we'll find it here in a second. Okay, so here's the sin of mankind, the murder, Cain and Abel, family of Cain. Here we go. I got it. It's Genesis 4, beginning with verse 17. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. And he built a city and he called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. So how much technology, George, does it take to design the architectural elements of a city and then construct it out of stone? But let it read, it gets better. It gets better. And so let's see here. Let's see. Okay, at 19, and Lamech took for himself 2 wives, Adah and Zillah. And Adah bore Jabal, who was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. I would say that animal husbandry is not something that the evolutionary community imagined Neanderthal man dragging his redheaded wife out of the cave and all of a sudden knowing how to breed sheep and cattle. But let's read on. It gets worse or better depending on you're talking about the intelligence of ancient man. Listen to this. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all those who play the harp and the flute. Now, I'm a saxophone player, and I realize that old Adolph Sax invented the saxophone in the 1800s, but flutes and harps and other instruments made of wood and metal have been around. See, this is pre-flood technology here. And then this is the part that gets my economic geology, copper, lead, zinc, gold, silver blood going. Listen to this. And as for Zillah, she also bore Tubal-Cain, who instructed every craftsman in bronze and iron. Well, let's wait for a minute. Bronze, iron. So that's iron. Bronze consists of, depending on who you talk to in antiquity, consists of copper, tin, antimony. So these people are smelting ores and making all of these different things. So there's a biblical argument for the intelligence of ancient man. Can you see what I'm saying, George?
Another great answer, Professor McQueen.
Sorry, I was going to add something, Stanley. I was on mute.
Sure, go ahead.
There's a couple other evidences which have come to the fore in recent times. I was talking to Ian Juby. I'm not sure if you know Ian Juby, but I was talking to Ian Juby about the Ark and its construction. They've actually, Ian has actually shown how you can actually create pitch by heating up silver birch bark and getting it to the point where it's thick. That's one specific one. But the other important one, he actually looked into the gopher wood. And most people thought it was a species of tree, but his investigations and research showed that gopher was a word for laminated beams. Now, any engineer there, structural engineer, will know that we use laminated beams for large spans because they are very strong and resistant to deflection. So these people, Noah, for example, would have had knowledge of lamination and how to improve the strength of the structure of the ark.
Now, before I take my 1 hour break, let me give another homework assignment. George has brought up a very important point about what is pitch. Dr. Henry Morris and me, the two of us, we spent a lot of time in the 80s. I've thought for years that the pitch of the ark was a type of tar or petroleum product that dated from the time of creation. Dr. Morris always counter-argued and said, no, if you look at the roots of that word pitch, it's probably something from a tree, like a sap or a sticky substance. And so do some research, those of you that want to pursue this before next week, and look up what this word in the pre-flood world would mean. George and I have already talked about the amount of petroleum that was produced during the processes of the flood. So we certainly know where pitch came from in the post-flood time. It's an interesting study, isn't it?
Oh, yes, definitely. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, as we gain more and more knowledge, David, we solve those problems, those so-called problems that people keep bringing up.
Exactly. Okay, Staying for Truth, if you drop my video, I'll take a break and be back in a minute to listen to what you and George discuss.
Perfect. Okay, let me drop you from the stream. This last hour has flown by. So much good information. I find this topic to be fascinating. And we had Professor McQueen. I think it was either the second or third show. Actually, I think it was the second and third show. Both of them where we touched on the Grand Canyon and went into a lot of this data. And that was like over 20 shows ago. So I'm really glad that we could focus on this important topic again. And there are always so many questions that can be asked and answered. And George, you and Professor McQueen are so thorough. So real quick, couple reminders for the audience. Again, Ram, Adam, myself, we're working diligently to get 2 new books out for everybody by September 1st. One book, Debunking Compromise, Debunking the Local Flood Compromise, as well as the Human Evolution Handbook. We've also got a ton of great debates, presentations, lectures for everybody as well. I'm working on some really, really awesome presentations and interviews for October, November as well. I know that's months away, but time flies by. So we're booking well in advance to make sure that we've got plenty of shows for the rest of 2021. We've also got a big debate at the end of the month, Noah's Ark and Noah's Flood, Fact or Fiction, Mark Reed and Kent Hovind. In 2 weeks, another flood debate between Kent Hovind and Sky Out. Is the Genesis flood global or local? We're also in the final stages of confirming the details for an epic debate with Professor David McQueen and Luca, who's in the chat. That's going to be a debate pertaining to the plausibility of the flood. Is there evidence for the flood? As well as a possible debate in September, October with somebody from Reasons to Believe, who will be having a discussion with Professor David McQueen. We've also got the theology debates for you guys as well in a couple weeks. Roughly 10 days, actually. Trinity versus Oneness. What is the biblical view of God? Matt Slick versus Stacy Turbeville. And last but not least, this week, this Thursday, Epic End Times Theology Debate. Dr. Kent Hovind versus Stacy Turbeville. So that being said, Brother George, any words from you? Great job so far tonight.
Yeah, I'm sure Professor McQueen's listening, so I'll just continue on with some of the evidences that that we were talking about. We talk about rapid deposition of limestone. Okay, you know, the evolutionist says. So just on a second. Sorry about that. I just had Mum ask me a question. Yeah, in terms of the rapid deposition, what we found numerous fossils, but the important part about these fossils is the size and the actual alignment that they're found in. In actual fact, I think they found one section of the Grand Canyon, which is now named Nautiloid Canyon, has an estimated billion fossils in it. One of the things they actually found, though, Standing, is they find that these nautiloids are free-swimming deep-sea animals. So the question is how do they become fossilized in one location? And the second question is, how did the fine-grained lime mud accumulate as it buried these animals? Some of them are over, I think, a foot, probably 18 inches long, and they're about a 6-inch diameter. So according to secular deposition rates, that would be almost impossible to achieve in those kind of conditions. What they actually found, though, is they made some analogies based on what happened at the Mount St. Helens eruption. We know that long cigar-shaped objects tend to align themselves in the direction of minimum resistance to flowing water. That's observable. This is an observation made from the logs in the floodplains of the rivers devastated by the 1980 floods from the eruption at Mount St. Helens. Okay, so when you look at it in comparison to the red wall, right? So the long axis of the nautiloid shells in the red wall limestone were actually aligned in the direction of the prevailing current. And they've looked at all these fossils, and the predominant current or flow seems to be going southeast to northwest. If these red wall limestone and these fossils took hundreds of millions of years to deposit, you wouldn't have one prevailing direction in the flow of that deposition. You'd have a mishmash of water flowing in all sorts of directions. Okay, well, if Professor McQueen's around, I've got a few other things I can share with the group with regards to erosion. So I'm going to share the screen.
Yeah, definitely, brother. Here we go.
Okay, this is a slide that our friend Sal Giordino presented. You'll notice there those red arrows represent the missing layers. And you can see there where the caption says, geologists want you to believe that the Grand Canyon took 5 to 6 million years of thousands of feet of erosion to form the canyon. However, you have 10 and 20 million years, and in the previous example, I said 140 million years in the red wall limestone area. So wouldn't you expect a lot of erosion to occur in that kind of period? That just seems implausible that they want you to believe a little river over 5 to 6 million years carved that entire canyon, but there's no evidence over tens to hundreds of millions of years of erosion between the layers. Unbelievable. You know, I don't know how they come to that logic. The other one is if you're aware about major rivers, they deposit a delta. You can see there the Amazon, the Mississippi, the Yangtze, and the Mekong, and the Nile all have very large deltas. That's because as they get towards the ocean, the velocities slow down, and the actual sedimentation that's carried by the water starts to settle towards the end of the river. So you get those big deltas that you can see there. In the Colorado River, however, the delta is very small. I think geologists have calculated this, the actual amount of erosion that occurred at the Grand Canyon, and they equate that only 1% of that erosion is found in the delta. So this must have been a fast catastrophic event to actually literally have the kind of force in the water to deposit that water into the ocean rather than in a delta. So that's another piece of evidence you need to consider. There's an estimated of 1,000 cubic miles of land has been eroded at the Grand Canyon. And it says if the river carved the canyon, then there should be enormously large delta, but the resulting delta at the end of the Colorado River only contains 1% of the sediments that were washed away. Where is the other 99% of this material? I'm not saying it should all be in the delta, but the delta should be a lot bigger than it is at the moment. So,
yeah, good point. Good point.
That's Steve. That's Dr. Steve Austin there, showing you the fossilized nautiloids that were found. And as I said earlier, I think there is an estimate of about over 1 billion fossils that have been recognized, or they believe there's at least 1 billion fossils in that layer. Yeah. And as I said, Professor McQueen, there's a predominant alignment to these fossils, which suggests the water was flowing in one direction.
Yeah, that's a very good point that you made. And Steve has worked many, many years to document these nautiloids. It's very important to realize that these nautiloids appear abruptly and fully formed, just as creation scientists. Yeah, there's a great picture to show you the size of these things. And as you go up and down the layers of the Grand Canyon, you don't find their precursors or antecedents. The fact that they appear abruptly is evidence for a catastrophic flood, and the fact that they appear fully formed is an evidence for special creation, not evolution.
Yeah, another piece of evidence, David. This is a graph of. I think I'll just hide that for a second. You'll find that there's a water depth. This is empirical science. I think Andrew Cumming was talking about empirical science, but this is empirical science, Andrew. This is the water depth, and utilizing the type of material found, you can actually determine what the velocity, I think it's in centimeters per second, is required to deposit that material. So you can see that they're quite fast, and it varies, by the way. Sorry?
Nephilim free. We hope that you don't mind us stealing your slide.
This one comes from Steve Austin's book.
Yeah. Our friend Neff uses it often too.
Yeah. So there is empirical evidence for what we're saying. You got to be open-minded and accept it. Okay. And I'll say that there's heaps of references after each chapter of Steve's book. There are hundreds of references provided that you can actually check to see what he's talking about. Okay. So it's something that he's making up.
Yes. If you'll share the screen back with me, SFT, I'll point out a book that you all should buy. This is in the series published by Master Books. This is called The Genius of Ancient Man, Evolution's Nightmare. Came out almost 10 years ago, and it's written by Don Landis as an editor through the Jackson Hole Bible College. Those of you that know the geography of the United States will realize that near the Grand Teton National Park in western Wyoming, there is a town called Jackson Hole. This is an ancient, this book is a wonderful argument and contains how many pages? Look like 100, yeah, over 100 pages of evidence of the genius of ancient man. Now, let's go back to what George was talking about and introduce you to why this business of the eroded, what the evolutionary community call unconformities, is such an important argument for us for the worldwide flood. So we'll begin with this vocabulary. Let's define the word stratigraphy. If you're looking at the layers of the Grand Canyon, those are stratigraphic layers. Standing for truth, if you'd put my secret diagram back up there, I'll make sure that we understand exactly what we're talking about. So if you look going up the canyon here, in the middle is what you actually find. In the middle is the great unconformity. And as you go up on the left-hand side, whoops, my other hand, as you go up through these gray units here, those are all unconformities. That is fossils that are not there. Now, McQueen, why in the world would you say fossils that are not there? Well, drop that image and we'll talk about that. You find the Cambrian rocks from Adam Sedgwick, but you do not find Ordovician rocks. You do not find Silurian rocks. You find a little bit of Devonian rocks. Now, the part of the Grand Canyon that's truly remarkable is this. Each unit, the green here would represent the coconino at the top. The red there would be the red wall limestone. The blue at the bottom would be something like the tapetes. As you walk down the canyon, as you hike down the canyon, you look over and you see the join between two stratigraphic units, two formations or groups. We'll come to that in a minute. And where they meet is called a contact. And again, using the Play-Doh here, if it's really the case that some of these sandstones are beaches that have moved over hundreds of millions of years across the way, you should find some sort of sand dune. And then the next layer would cover that over so that you would look at the next layer here, and there would be yellow on one side and yellow on the other side. And you would see what George and I have seen on the eastern coast of Australia, in the Mediterranean, and me in Florida, and the Gulf of Mexico. You see a beach, but you've got all these dunes and stuff, but that's not what you find. What you actually find is this. You find what is called a knife edge contact. I need some more yellow there to make this clear. You find a knife edge contact between the stratigraphic units in the Grand Canyon. In other words, you find something that looks like this picture. You got a stratigraphic unit 1, 2, and 3, but no sign of erosion in between. And as George has pointed out, for heaven's sakes, between the tapetes and the red wall is at least the missing Ordovician and Silurian, which is millions of years. Now, let's learn our next, George is working on his diploma in geology, which you'll get at Christmas time.
PhD.
And he will get that. And so let's introduce a new word, and that's the word Code of Stratigraphic Nomenclature. I learned for several months the details of how you name these formations. When we were talking about the tapetes, I mentioned that in the western U.S., the tapetes has what's called a type locality. The vocabulary that's used there is that, see, I'm trying to look here. Interesting to consider the evidence for massive flow. Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. But let me go on with this. In the code of stratigraphic nomenclature, you can't go out to these stratigraphic units and just name them anything. They've got to be tied into what's called a type locality. University of Tennessee, where I went undergraduate in the 70s, is in Knoxville, Tennessee, which is in Knox County, Tennessee. And the Cambro, there's part of Cambrian in there. Cambro-Ordovician Knox group, which consists of a dolomite called the Knox limestone, Knox dolomite rather. That's the type locality from it. And so you go to these type localities, and then you have to choose from these words down at the bottom. Again, it's beyond the scope of today, but you can look these up. What is a formation? Is there a member of a formation? Why is it called the Knox group? Well, that means that there's sandstones and shales, like the Chickamauga and others, associated with it. Well, what is a unit within it? And then within the unit, what would be like a bed of coal and so forth? So these 5 words there are worthy of your attention. And so when we think about the Grand Canyon, let's be very clear as we think about the problems to the evolutionary community. The Coconino sandstone is so extensive that it goes across state boundaries, state lines. It includes parts of Arizona, Utah, and its equivalents go great distances. Put the diagram back up for me, SFT again, and I'll point something out. I like it being in the middle because I can move my hands, and make things work. If you go all the way to the top of the diagram, you'll see that as you get to the top of the diagram, these are the rocks in the Grand Canyon, you come up to the Coconino sandstone. Now, I can't see the diagram well enough. Is that yellow layer near the top? Am I reading my own chart correctly? Is that Coconino? Can you read it, SFT?
It's blurry on my end.
At this level, that yellow one there, is that Coconino? Or is it down here?
Yeah, it is a little bit blurry for me too.
Again, but let me make my point. You see how these units, the evolutionary community exaggerate. You see how they draw in this area between that purple and gray right there, a big unconformity. Well, there's not a real big unconformity in a lot of these areas. There's a minor amount. The point is that these rocks here, now you can drop the chart, fit much better with the diagram that George has showed you earlier. You can drop that diagram for now. And let me go back to this. They fit much better into this kind of model where you have sediments and granites down below the Great Unconformity, down in this area, and then the rocks of the Grand Canyon. I noticed a question flashed to get across earlier, Standing for Truth, that asked a question something like, have you ever touched rocks below the Great Unconformity that really are sandstones and shales and yet contain no fossils? And the answer is yes. I've seen those in the Grand Canyon. I've seen those in the Great Smoky Mountain National Park, in the Southern Appalachians, seen them in Nova Scotia. So I've seen them all over the world in my travels. Well, Nova Scotia is not such a good example, but the Southern Appalachians is certainly an example, as is these rocks at the Grand Canyon. Now, these have stratigraphic names called the Hackatai Shale and Dock Sandstone. You can look those up. It's DOX. And those are examples. So now, George, comment, then we'll take the next.
Yeah, David, I have to leave shortly. Can I give my summary?
Yes,
and I'll
please.
leave you guys to it.
Yes, please.
Now, I began by saying, we all start off with presuppositions. Now, my summary will consist effectively 7 points, but the importance of the interpretive framework, you have to assess both interpretations based on the evidence that you see. And we've shown evidence based, for example, the marine shell fossils, that the continent was once under ocean. Okay, that suggests some kind of a flood. Okay.
Yes.
Also, it suggests rapid burial, because you can't get these limestone depositions burying those creatures at the deposition rates the secular geologists want you to believe. The widespread strata that exists not only continent-wide but worldwide. The long distance of the sediment transport. We find, I think even Neff mentioned, if you find sand and things in amongst the limestone where it wasn't local, it came from somewhere else. The rapid erosion between the strata, as we said, while geologists continue to debate the location of the Grand Canyon, uniformities and the amount of time they represent, evidence continue to be amassed, which indicate short time periods between successive strata. Regional unconformities do exist between some strata in Grand Canyon, but the evidences favor rapid erosion. I'll reiterate, has anyone documented millions of years between Grand Canyon strata? No, they haven't, not to my knowledge. And of course, this leads us to the success of the flood model. All the evidences that we've mentioned is effectively confirming what we're saying about our model. That confirms the success of the flood model. I'm sorry, but I have to leave, so I'll leave you guys to it, and I'll catch the rest of the stream when I come back.
Okay, good. Thank you, George, and your help is always appreciated.
You're welcome, and God bless to everyone.
God bless you, George. God bless you. Great job.
Now, notice Neff's comment there. The Tapete sandstone, the red wall limestone, can be traced across the entire U.S., Canada, and over into England. Well, look at the model that I took from my grandchild's toy box. If the red illustrates or represents the red wall limestone, and then you've got some other strata, and you've got the yellow coconino sandstone, notice that in Nephilim's comment there, in Neff's comment, many people, and this goes back to John Wesley Powell back in the 1800s, many people have noticed that these contacts are razor thin contacts. There's no evidence of erosion between the Hermit Shale and the red wall limestone, as Nephilim talked about a minute ago. And see, this is a remarkable evidence for the worldwide flood. And this is why. The evolutionary community wants us to believe that you can get strata as extensive as what Neff pointed out there, coconino sandstone being truly a continent-wide sandstone, and it extends worldwide in its equivalence. How can they explain that these contacts, which I've drawn there with the arrows, how can they explain that they're knife-edge contacts? I've seen this with my own eyes. You would expect, instead of this, let me get some more paper here and draw this out. if the old Earth evolutionary model was true, then this is what you would expect. You would expect that, get a Sharpie here that'll work. You would expect that in between these layers, you would see clear erosive evidence as you go down. I'll draw my tree again. If you look at these layers, if they are really migrating shorelines over tens of thousands of years, you would expect the same kind of beach features that you see in, if the present is the key to the past, as they argue so clearly, as they argue so with such a high voice, you should be able to go to Eastern Australia, the White Cliffs of Dover, the Gulf of Mexico here in America, and you should be able to find ample evidence of this. Let me get a color here to draw in some color so you can more clearly see what I'm saying. If it was really true that these erosion events happened over a long time, then this is what the evolutionary community should expect. They should predict that you would get not knife edge contacts, but undulating contacts every time that you hiked a different trail in the Grand Canyon. And again, every intro geology textbook always talks about the Grand Canyon as supposedly the big evidence for the stratigraphy of the world. Well, let's make another point here, and I'll use this diagram on the cover of this handbook that I helped put together all those years ago. If you look, you go all the way up through the Coconino. Well, there are reptile and amphibian footprints there, but no fossils of the footprints, no fossils of the amphibians. Where do you have to go in Arizona and Utah to find the Morrison Formation that has dinosaur fossils in it? How far do you have to go to get what's not at the Grand Canyon? The Triassic, the Jurassic, the Cretaceous. Well, you've got to keep going north in what's called the Grand Staircase. If you have an opportunity to travel in the American West, you should start at the Grand Canyon and then go around, get on the North Rim, and then start driving north the way Mrs. McQueen and I did in 1976. I've seen this with my own eyes. You go up and you find huge mesas and bluffs and areas that look like this. This is one of my favorite intro geology books. I used this in 1980 when I was teaching at George Mason University. This is Arches National Monument, and you can see these sandstones that are there. And so the summary of what the Grand Canyon teaches us is that you find these stratigraphic units that have not missing time the way the intro geology book talks about, but they have missing fossils. And that's the key. The reason that there aren't a lot of Ordovician and Silurian, the reason that the words Ordovician and Silurian are not used in the Grand Canyon is that in these stratigraphic units, in these formations, you don't find typical Silurian and Ordovician index fossils. The topic of index fossils we can return to as we go through the time between now and Christmas. But the way that a rock is known as being a certain age is because of the index fossils. In the early 1970s, I worked for a United States Geological Survey geologist named Leonard Harris. You can find a number of papers written by him that deal with index fossils called conodonts that are found in Middle Ordovician strata in the Southern Appalachians. Well, one project he assigned me to was to look to the east of the Appalachian Mountains, to the east of the Southern Appalachian Mountains, to see if there were equivalent strata that had been put under tremendous heat and pressure and turned into metamorphic rock. Well, many of you will remember from earlier in your training that if you have the sedimentary rock limestone and it's put under tremendous heat and pressure, it converts to what's called marble. And in the area east of the Great Smoky Mountains, there is a well-known marble deposit. And as I did the research in the early 70s, I came across a paper where someone had found a trilobite in this marble. Now, that's extraordinarily rare. But what did that mean? The radiometric dates for that marble east of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, the radiometric dates dissolved. And it all of a sudden became 600 or 500 million years old. Why? Because a trilobite was found in it. Now, some geologists within the United States Geological Survey thought that somebody planted it, but let's say it's real. It really was a trilobite. It shows the power of paleontology, shows the power of index fossils. SFT, let's go on to the next question.
Well, great job, Professor McQueen. Great information. Such a fascinating and important topic. So I appreciate your presentations. Have we answered this question? This question came in, Professor McQueen, from Doki Doki Bible Club.
Okay.
The question is the rapid erosion explanation for unconformities naturalism of the gaps? Is there any evidence for this?
Yeah, this is something that's been discussed for hundreds of years by creation scientists, by flood geologists, and we can use this, and I'll go down in amongst my boxes here and find a different color and draw this in. Her question about this naturalism of the gaps deals with this. If you're moving over a huge area and you're walking miles and miles, and I'll draw my tree here again, so you'll know that this is a cross section and not a map view. If you walk across a group of rocks like this, and you find the red rocks in there, the evolutionary geologist, traditionally, the old earth geologist will say one of two things. He'll say, oh, well, that is in the area I'm going to circle in red, what would be called an angular unconformity there. And so there's clearly been erosion between those two layers. But there's another whole explanation of this that many people, these are petroleum geologists and others, find much more satisfactory. And that revolves around a word that I'll spell for you and assign you to look up before next time. It's the word facies, Facies. This is the word facies. Now, what does that mean? What it means is that you're looking at the same time frame. Let's say that I put black bars above these units and say that everything that you see there occurred 5 months into the flood. So I'll put a 5 to one side. So what that means is that the red, which might be a very coarse-grained sandstone, is abutting up against a fine-grained sandstone, that's the green, but that eroded and occurred 5 months into the flood at some place on the earth. But remember that we're asking the old earth evolutionary geologist to explain not so much that, but we're asking them to explain this. Let's don't go all over the earth. Let's stick to what's one of the major outcroppings of rock on Earth. You see how flat they are. They've been deposited flat lying, and they're found today flat lying. Now, that's actually worth elaborating on. Just how unique, actually, is the Grand Canyon itself. How unique is the Grand Canyon? Well, in northwest Africa, there are a series of canyons in the Atlas Mountains of Morocco that a creation geologist, flood geologist named John Wood-Morripy studied. And if you go to that area, you can find all of the units that are traditionally talked about in Geology 101. Carry out some dinner, Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, all the way up through Tertiary and Quaternary in a series of canyons near each other in northwest Africa. But you've got to search many other places on Earth to find anything equivalent to the Grand Canyon. Remember that the Grand Canyon is a mile deep, that in the area of the Grand Canyon National Park, South Rim, you can walk down, hike down. It takes all day, but you're going through 5,000 feet of sediment. So the Grand Canyon is one of the most unique areas on Earth. Are there other canyons? My friends that have been to the island of Maui, I guess, in Hawaii, says there's a beautiful canyon there, but it's a series of volcanic rocks. There are canyons in India, in huge areas of basalt called the Deccan Traps that have canyons in them. There aren't that many places on Earth that Charles Darwin could have gone to test his hypothesis. See, if his idea was right, that we got to give geology 100 years to find transitional organisms in sedimentary rocks, the Grand Canyon argues against the whole concept of transitional forms. It's as Dwayne Giss said in all of his debates from the 70s all the way up through the 80s and 90s. The fossils you do find in the Grand Canyon are like what I showed you earlier. If it's now you don't find a reptile or amphibian in the Grand Canyon, but if you did, it would be like this Louisiana turtle. It would appear abruptly and fully formed. You got to drive the point home for those of you that might be joining the show late. The abruptness means that old Boudreaux, the Louisiana turtle here, was buried catastrophically, or you would never find this level of preservation. That's the abrupt part. The fact that this thing is found fully formed, and we can't even find any good transitional organisms between all the major groups of reptile, amphibian, primates, mammals. But let's make it even worse. You find bits of bark and you find bits of leaves in the western United States in these coal beds out there and coal beds back in the eastern U.S. When you find these fossil plants, they too appear abruptly and fully formed. Those of you that are following people that are critics like Erica, whose gibbon has been struck in the belly somehow, Erica and her followers, come explain to us paleobotany. Come explain to us how we get from a fern to a maple tree. You think that vertebrate and invertebrate fossils are hard to explain. Let's explain the evolution of botany using Darwin's concepts. SFT, what do you think of that?
I think that's great information, and I think those are some solid challenges put forth to the critics. Because oftentimes I find that we are answering their challenges, but the challenges to their model or their starting point in terms of evolution and deep time kind of go unaddressed. So those are some great points, Professor McQueen. As Dr. Gish has put it, what we find in the fossil record is stasis and abrupt appearance and
Exactly.
extinction. So those
And
things
extinction,
aren't going
right.
to take a fish to fisherman.
Well, let's go to another question, SFT. What do you got there on your chart?
So here is, we've got a couple questions left, and here's one that pertains specifically to the Grand Canyon model right here.
Yes.
So question, Professor McQueen, what are some common objections to your Grand Canyon model or understanding of the Grand Canyon pertaining to the global flood and young Earth creation? And do you find any of these objections convincing or challenging?
Okay, let's go to that, and let's talk about the part of the Bible that starts in Genesis chapter 8, where the flood waters begin to go down. One of the criticisms that biblical geologists, flood geologists, have lodged against Steve Austin's idea of a impounded lake called Lake Hopi, or it's got other names. Mike Ord is critical of that view. Tom Cleary at ICR is critical of where exactly Dr. Austin believes this impounded lake was and the spillover of it. Remember that the idea of the spillover is you get a body of water like this that reaches, if I can do this without pouring it on Ms. McQueen's floor, it reaches a tipping point where there's so much water, and then there's a breach in what you can imagine as a very extensive, hundreds of kilometers, hundreds of miles wide dam, if you will, and then the water begins to flow down. Well, some evolutionists that have looked at what would be called the erosion of the Grand Canyon have pointed out that those of us that believe in a catastrophic model can't explain how the water will get over certain arches and anticlinal features in the Grand Canyon. Well, our counter argument to that is twofold. We're talking about a catastrophic movement of water. We're not talking about movement of water as I do it like this. We're talking about a flood at the level of, let's say, the tsunami that hit Japan. I've seen those videos where you see school buses being carried miles inland and so forth. So we're not talking about some sort of gentle stream. We're talking about a catastrophic movement of millions of square meters of water, or put in gallons, tens of millions of gallons of water over a very short time. And so it would hit that obstruction and slosh over it and go to the other side. A second counter argument to that is some research that Dr. Steve Austin and others have done on the north rim of the Grand Canyon, looking at evidences for what they consider to be this ancient shoreline of the lake that was impounded. So if there's no way that this lake could have gotten near the Grand Canyon because of these structural geology issues, how come you find evidences in the what's called the sedimentology of these layers that indicate that you had a situation like this? I'll use these peppers here as an example. You know, these peppers from the grocery store have not a round shape, but they have kind of an axis to them. So if I turn them both going the same way, if you look at some of the rocks north of the Grand Canyon, they form what's called an imbricate structure. And so you can think of this as if this rock is a boat pulling a skier, and that skier gets lifted up only if it's like an airplane where you've got, a force going down, drag, lift, and so forth. But you find these imbricate structures north of the Grand Canyon. It's an additional evidence for the flood models. Now, there's another point that I must emphasize. Our critics often say, oh, you guys did well in Sunday school, but there's never any argument about the details of your model. Notice the three names that I mentioned. Dr. Steve Austin was a lead author on the paper I was part of that SFT showed you earlier. Michael Ord has been on this feed many times, and he has a different idea about the erosion of the Grand Canyon. And then the third one, Dr. Tim Clary of ICR, has yet a third theory, a hypothesis. If what we were doing were Bible studies all the time, how come three men with graduate degrees, two of which have PhDs, come up with data that indicate variations of this model? It proves to me and to honest people, I think, that the catastrophic young Earth model has merit because it's able to explain things that the evolutionary community explains away by what we here at Standing for Truth often call rescue devices. Help us, SFT, as we get to the 2-hour mark. Give us an example of a rescue device that troubles you.
Great points, Professor McQueen, that you made there as well. I really appreciate it. This has been a great talk. Yes, we do oftentimes talk about rescue devices. I've personally had many different debates and discussions, and typically I focus on biology and genetics and demonstrating what's called separate ancestry, the fact that God created Adam and Eve separate from all other forms of life, including chimpanzees, the great apes, so on and so forth. And I find many rescue devices, one that is constantly put forth pertaining to mutations, Professor McQueen.
Yes.
Because we know mutations are accumulating from generation to generation. Actually,
Right.
The mutation rate roughly in humans is 100 new mutations per person per individual.
I see.
Every single generation. Now, what we know is most of these mutations are disease causing, as you know, David. They are deleterious and damaging.
Yes.
But most of them are what's called nearly neutral, as in they're invisible to selection. So they accumulate and selection can't see them.
Yes.
So the rescue device I find over and over again is just that. Well, natural selection can filter out these mutations, and it's a rescue device.
Now, do you find SFT that people use human DNA, chimpanzee DNA? Oh, we're 90% the same as a chimp. That's a rescue device, isn't it? Also.
Amen. And it's a rescue device because it doesn't help them. Because when we consider the entirety of the genomes, including these gaps and copy number variations, because typically they just want to compare similar sequences and ignore a lot of the gaps. It's actually about 88% similar in terms of chimpanzees and humans. But Professor McQueen, that's about 400 million DNA differences that need to be fixed from the split roughly 6 million years ago from the chimpanzee human common ancestor. And fixation rates are incredibly slow. So there's a huge waiting time problem, in other words, for the evolutionists that want to say humans and chimpanzees are related. But as you know, Professor McQueen, there's rescue device after rescue device from
And let me give an example from the Grand Canyon. Were we to ever find a classically trained old Earth geologist to debate me, probably one of the things he would say about the Grand Canyon is, well, McQueen, how come you don't find human fossils mixed in with the um, fossils that you find at the Tapeats and the Red Wall and so forth? McQueen, how come it's the case that you don't find a complete jumble of all kinds of different species in one fossil graveyard? Well, that is a rescue device in my mind, because what they're ignoring is what amounts to, going back to Dr. Morse's book, which was researched in the 50s. So these are 70-year-old arguments, that what you're seeing is ecological zonation. You find similar types of animals like trilobites and crinoids that grow near live near the ocean bottom. You find them buried first. And then as you go up the column with animals like dinosaurs that could escape the rising floodwaters during those first 6 months, you find them elsewhere. What is the answer? And we could have a whole program about this. How come we don't routinely find human fossils mixed in with all this? For heaven's sakes, Dr. Henry Morris himself, my mentor, thought there might be 1 billion, that's a billion with a B, people alive at the time of the Great Flood. This fellow, John Wood Morphy, that I mentioned, revised that down to 100 million. Well, whether you're talking about 100 million or 1 billion people, wouldn't you expect to find a lot more human fossils? And there have been some human fossils that have been reported over the years, kind of hidden in the basement, according to John Mackay of the British Museum in London. But what's an explanation of it? Most people on Earth live within, in our modern world, a 1 or 2 hour drive of the coast. People have always enjoyed the coast, whether they're in China or England or Australia. So if the pre-flood population was concentrated around this one world continent, when those tremendous floodwaters hit during what I call phase 1 of the flood, the first 40 days of intense erosion and deposition, the people on the coastline, they were caught off guard. Now, some of them might have been able to scramble in a boat and get away, but most of them would have been buried in deep sedimentary basins where we now find crude oil at 5,000 feet, 10,000 feet, 20,000 feet. And remember what I've taught you in the past, that the cores that are brought up are about the diameter of this Play-Doh here, a couple inches in diameter. The probability of finding a human molar or a femur in this kind of environment is very rare. So that's an example of a geologic rescue device.
Oh, I love that answer, Professor McQueen. And I like to point out, too, that according to Genesis, the creation account, God created 2 human beings, Adam and Eve, and fully working ecosystems of animals, populations of animals. And therefore, I would expect billions of fossils, essentially, of animals versus very few to almost no human fossils in flood layers, of course, not post-flood layers with Neanderthal and so on and so forth. And that is exactly what we find. So, and I love that answer, Professor McQueen.
This is something that our students out there in the audience can work on. The equations that Dr. Henry Morris used are in his own writings. You know, what if it's the case that he'd have made a math error? You know, maybe they're not 100 million or 1 billion people. Maybe there were only 200,000 people or 20,000 people. I think there was a large population, judging from the nature of the flood. But let's see what Redefined Living says here. If we grant a local flood for the sake of argument, can we find unique layers or evidences in that region that would support the local flood argument? Well, my recommendation to you, Redefined Living, is to go on Amazon and buy a copy of a book that I was given as a high school graduation present in 1970. It's called the Unger Bible Handbook. Then buy one that's called the Haley's Bible Handbook. The Haley's Bible Handbook was given to a lot of us that went off to college in the 60s. And in the Haley's Bible Handbook, a bit different than Unger's, but in the Haley's Bible Handbook, there's a picture of a sandstone layer in the Euphrates River Valley, not far from the Ur of the Chaldees, that this dear brother put in as evidence of the flood. And so he gives us one layer as evidence of Noah's flood. This is a kind of argument that the local flood people love, but it makes no biblical sense the way SFT described. He get a 20-minute presentation on what the Bible actually says about a global versus local flood. So he's got the theological side of it you ought to go back and look at. And I'm telling you as a geologist that if the ark was built to be able to go 10 cubits or 10 feet or 20 feet or whatever it was, in other words, it had a draft to get over the highest mountain. In my model, the highest mountain in pre-flood was maybe 10,000 feet, but still, that's got to be 10,000 feet of water worldwide. You can't have a local flood that piles up 10,000 feet of water.
That's a great answer. That's a great response, Professor McQueen. Great question, Redefine Living. Again, David, brother, over 2 hours has flown by as usual.
Yeah.
We could listen to you all day. You're a wealth of information. Did you want to now move into some concluding thoughts, some concluding?
No, for tonight, I'm pretty tired, so I want to throw the compliment back your way, SFT. You've been very kind to mention that I've got now over 20 programs with the help of you and George and Nephilim Free and others that adds up to hours and hours of discussion of geologic topics. I want to recommend to our listeners that they not forget you and the fact that you yourself have let's see, Standing for Truth has been around now for 3 years, 2 years. What's the anniversary of it?
3 years, roughly.
Yeah, 3 years. So you've got 3 years worth of presentations on these very important topics about the genome, very important topics about the buildup of mutations. There was such a hopeful idea when I was in college that mutations were going to explain the changes that could occur. And even the famous paleontologist, Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard, had to reject it in the end. So thank you for your kind words about my book and my presentations. As I ask you to drop my video and say goodnight, show the audience some of your books and where to find your presentations. I think that would be a good way to return the compliment, my friend.
Well, I appreciate that, Professor McQueen. As I've said many times, you're a blessing to this ministry, and I can't thank you enough. So again, thank you, Professor McQueen. Thanks as well for the kind words there. And I will drop your feed until
I'm going to go ahead and move my cursor to leave the studio, and I will see you next week, my friend.
Okay. God bless, Brother McQueen.
Good night.
Thank you again for a must-watch show. So everybody in the audience, thank you so much. We still got a great chat. We've had tons of great questions and a lively chat. So please stay tuned for some more shows this week, starting with an epic end times theology debate this Thursday. But we got a lot more lectures, presentations, discussions for you guys. The Independent Origins Handbook on Kindle, the Kindle edition, just became available actually during this show. We put it in a couple days ago to get approved. It's been in review for a couple days, and it's available now. So please check that out. The Independent Origins Handbook, which is this one. So you can get a hard copy. That's the colored version. That's the black and white version. But now there is a Kindle version for you as well. As I said at the beginning of the show, Matt Man and myself were finalizing a couple more books for you guys that should be available. Our hope is to have them available in September. That's why when we're not live, essentially that's all we're working on, as well as putting together some presentations and rebuttal videos to some other atheist or evolutionist videos that we've kind of come across. So that being said, guys, I appreciate all your support. You guys are the life and blood of this channel. We appreciate it. God bless everybody. I agree. Outstanding presentation. Stefan says, I appreciate that. Please check out the playlist with Professor David McQueen. You'll see that in the description box, as well as a playlist titled Amazing Evidence for a Worldwide Flood, because we've had so many presentations and lectures from high-level flood researchers. So please check that out. I appreciate it. Doki Doki Bible Club, ebook, the Independent Origins Handbook. So we've got ebooks of most of our books. There's a couple we're still working on. And for the new books that we have coming out, we'll make sure that we get those in the form of an ebook as well. So that being said, everybody, God bless. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, thank you so much for the support. And Standing for Truth is out.